Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we're going to leave the modern world behind for a bit and step directly into the suffocating humidity, the smell of turned earth, and the gritty reality of the 17th century Chesapeake Bay. When we think of early America, we almost always picture brave pioneers building a new world. But for the vast majority of ordinary people crossing the Atlantic, early colonial life absolutely wasn't a story of freedom. It was a landscape dominated by grueling agricultural labor, disease, and just pure desperation. We're going to explore how the everyday lives, the survival strategies, and literally the very bodies of impoverished workers laid the foundations for the American economy. To really understand this world, we have to listen to the voices of those who actually lived it. Take a look at this devastating letter from Richard Freethorn. He was just a child, bound out by his home parish in England under the Poor Law, and sent across the ocean to a plantation called Martin's Hundred in 1623. He writes to his parents, literally begging them to buy out his contract. He's surrounded by fellow servants dying of scurvy and the bloody flux, which was dysentery, and he survives on nothing but water gruel. They called it lobalolly. It was basically a cold, tasteless, watery mush that provided virtually no real sustenance for a body breaking down under extreme physical labor. Tragically, Richard Freethorn never made it home. He died a year later. Just one of thousands consumed by this colonial plantation machine. So that brings us to a really profound historical contradiction, and this is going to serve as the intellectual hook for our whole explainer today. These migrants came seeking opportunity, right? They wanted land and a way out of the crushing poverty of Europe. So how did the grand promise of the New World become a literal nightmare of bound labor, physical suffering, and early death for so many people? Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the promise of independence. So the English colonial project had a massive structural problem right out of the gate. They had an absolute abundance of land, but a catastrophic scarcity of labor to actually work it, especially once tobacco proved to be this highly profitable export. But here's the catch. The cost of a transatlantic ticket was prohibitively expensive. We're talking more than half a year's wages for a British laborer. Because ordinary folks just couldn't afford it, a staggering 66%, so roughly two-thirds of all immigrants to the American colonies, arrived as indentured servants. They voluntarily sold 4 to 7 years of their labor just to pay for the ship ride over. Now you might be wondering, what on earth convinced them to sign away years of their lives? Well, the ideological justification for this temporary exploitation was the promise of freedom dues. This was basically a mandatory severance package waiting for them at the very end of their contract. Take a look at these specific items from a 1639 Maryland statute. We are talking about basic material survival here. You got a new suit of clothes to replace your rags, an axe and some hoes to clear the wilderness, corn to eat, and crucially, 50 acres of land. Though, ironically, that land was usually uncleared, hostile wilderness that required even more backbreaking labor just to survive on. Still, this was the dream, right? Temporary subjugation in exchange for permanent independence. Which brings us to Section 2, a brutal colonial reality. So, on paper, it looked like a fair exchange, labor for passage, room and board. But in reality, these servants were stepping into a deadly environment. Right upon arrival, they faced what was called the summer seasoning. This was a terrifying period where newly arrived workers basically just watched their fellow passengers die off one by one because their bodies couldn't acclimate to the malarial environment. And if they somehow survived the disease, well, then they faced the custom of the country. This was a legal loophole where local juries often arbitrarily extended contracts for years, sometimes up to 15 years for those who arrived without written documents. Plus, violence was just a constant undercurrent. Masters were legally permitted to physically punish them. The really crucial point here is the immense psychological shock this inflicted on ordinary people. Back in England, an indenture was a personal labor contract. But in the colonies, to feed the hungry stomach of the tobacco market, human beings were transformed into chattel property. Your contract could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited, exactly like a piece of livestock. Free men and women essentially became financial assets, traded at an open market. Let's ground this in a human story for a second. Imagine Rachel Walker and Margaret McKibben stepping off the creaking wooden deck of this exact ship, the Friendship, in Philadelphia back in 1773. They likely left desperate poverty in Ireland, dreaming of a much better life. But instead of opportunity, they found themselves being surveyed by potential buyers. Cold cash was exchanging hands right there on the docks as local merchants purchased their contracts. They stepped straight into a highly exploitative, pre-industrial system where they were entirely at the mercy of their new masters. Let's move into Section 3, monetizing women's bodies. Now, what's really interesting about this is the harsh, totally calculated language used by the merchant class. You frequently see letters from colonial merchants literally begging their agents to send no more women or calling female servants troublesome. In this hyper-competitive, labor-starved economy, male masters viewed female servants as massive reproductive liabilities. Because an indenture was a strict property asset, a woman's pregnancy was legally treated as a severe contractual breach. The colonial state actually created what were known as bastardy laws. These statutes effectively converted a natural human biological function, pregnancy and childbirth, into a punitive corporate financial debt owed to the master. So while male servants were monitored for their physical labor, female servants lived under this intensely dystopian surveillance of both their labor and their reproductive capacity. And the human cost of these laws was just devastating. Total celibacy was required of female servants. If a woman became pregnant, she was hauled into court, and years were added to her contract just to compensate the master for her lost time. And it gets worse. A newborn child could actually be torn from their mother by parish church wardens, and that child's labor would be sold off until adulthood. The welfare of the family was completely erased in favor of protecting a master's economic investment. It's a really chilling reality. Let's turn now to Section 4, rebellions in courtrooms. Yet, despite this horrific systemic abuse, these laborers demonstrated incredible resilience. They didn't just passively accept their subjugation, they actively fought back. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the great historical contradictions of colonial America. Despite being treated as property, indentured servants successfully used the legal system to claim their rights as citizens of the colonial polity. If a master withheld their freedom dues, or if the abuse became too severe, servants actually took them to court. And surprisingly, colonial courts often supported them. They would waive court fees and even provide pro bono attorneys. Servants won many of these cases, fighting tooth and nail to secure their promised independence. But as the 17th century wore on, the available land dried up and tobacco prices completely crashed. Suddenly, you had this massive, growing underclass of heavily armed, deeply frustrated former servants who literally couldn't survive. This tension exploded rapidly into Bacon's Rebellion. And you know what terrified the wealthy elites the most about this rebellion? It was the dangerous alliance formed on the battlefield. You had impoverished white indentured servants fighting shoulder to shoulder with enslaved black workers against the colonial government. This brings us to Section 5, the shift to slavery. Let's step back and see how this builds. Following the fallout from these rebellions, we see a very deliberate, legal devolution of labor. In the early 1600s, white servants and African laborers worked right alongside each other in the fields. But following those armed uprisings and ongoing labor shortages, the colonial elite began crafting laws to permanently divide the working class and solidify slavery. By 1705, the legal code had fully consolidated a system where European indentures were temporary, but African enslavement was a permanent, hereditary condition. The most terrifying turning point in this timeline is this 1662 law passed by the Virginia General Assembly. It declared that a child's status, whether they were free or enslaved, followed the condition of the mother. This completely reversed centuries of English common law, which traditionally followed the father. This chilling statute explicitly allowed the colonial economic machine to mathematically reproduce its own enslaved labor force generation after generation, declaring that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. To prevent another cross-racial uprising like Bacon's Rebellion, the legislature deliberately severed the social ties between poor white servants and enslaved Africans. They enacted massive fines and devastating extensions of servitude for white women who had children with African men. If the woman couldn't pay, she was sold into further bondage and her child was bound out for 31 years. The entire goal was to culturally and legally fracture people of similar economic classes. They were replacing class unity with a permanent racial division. So as we step back to view this entire civilizational arc, we are left to confront a really haunting reality. The mechanics of human commodification, the buying and selling of contracts, the monetization of female biology, the intense surveillance of labor, All of that was pioneered and tested on indentured servants. We really have to ask ourselves, how did the temporary exploitation of European bodies serve as the brutal blueprint for the permanent, hereditary enslavement of African bodies? It's a profound and settling question about the roots of our economy, and it's one that leaves the mud, the sweat, and the ghosts of the Chesapeake lingering long after those contracts expired.